The morning fog lay over the estate like a secret someone had not yet chosen to confess. Before we begin, subscribe and turn on notifications to follow stories where private choices reshape lives and nations. It was 1847, and Ashbourne House stood on a gentle rise above the braided river, white paint flaking, columns that once gleamed now shaded by moss. The widow Eleanor Harcourt ruled the house with a composure that read as certainty, her gloves never showing a smudge and her voice rarely raising above a cool, instructive tone. Inside the parlor, the curtains trembled with every carriage that passed, and the scent of coal smoke and lemon polish hung in the air. She made one quiet decision that would ripple farther than she imagined. She chose a young servant named Miriam to guide her sons through a lesson she believed essential. What Eleanor meant as instruction would become a mirror that reflected a family truth none of them had been ready to face. Over the course of this tale, we will see the collapse of what was and the slow cultivation of what might be. As the river glittered beyond the far trees, the house seemed to hold its breath, as if listening for the first of many reckonings to come. What would you do if the order you were taught to preserve asked you to deny another human being their dignity? Eleanor Harcourt was 39, recently widowed after her husband Arthur died of a fever the previous autumn. Her posture and habits were inheritances as much as the estate itself. She had been raised among carriage wheels and sermons, taught that property was lineage and discipline the engine of family survival. Her decision to place Miriam, a woman whose family had labored on these grounds for decades, at the side of her sons, felt to her like a necessary correction, a way to shape the next Harcourt generation into stewards rather than sentimentalists. Outside the circle of the house, a community watched and whispered. Among them were Dr. Elise Moreau, who tended the sick, Reverend Samuel Price, who kept the moral ledger of the town, bank manager William Caldwell, who counted mortgages by lamplight, overseer Thomas Greer, who managed labor in the fields, housekeeper Agnes Reed, who had kept the household machinery running for years, lawyer Jonathan Pike, who drafted the papers that bound people and property, and neighbor Mrs. Whitaker, who kept a sharp eye on who dined with whom. Miriam Cartwright had been born on the river plain and grew into her role with a quiet steadiness that came from knowing how to read a weathered face and a weary hand. She carried with her an old family song that had been hummed beside hearth fires and barn rafters, a melody that held the names of ancestors nobody had written down. The county clerk kept registers, the pulpit kept codes, and the ledgers kept numbers, but Miriam kept memory. The house smelled of boiled starch, wax, and the faint iron tang of keys. In the nursery, where oil lamps cast trembling circles, Eleanor made her choice in a voice that was more instruction than request. The sons, Henry 20 and Charles 17, listened. The three men who would shape this decision sat at the table the way they had always sat in family scenes. George Whitcomb, the steward, a man with a lined forehead and conscientious hands, Thomas Greer, the overseer, broad and impatient, and Agnes Reed, who ferried gossip the way she ferried teacups, careful where she stepped. The first scene where the order was placed unfolded as a series of short, charged exchanges. Eleanor spoke and others answered in a cadence of obligation and surprise. Eleanor said, "Miriam will instruct the boys in duty and firm bearing." George asked if she understood what that would mean. Eleanor said she did, and that discipline required authority. Thomas said, "The boys will learn to command by seeing command enacted." Agnes folded her hands and said, "Miriam is known for patience and wisdom." Miriam, summoned into the parlor, came barefoot from the back rooms with the quiet sound of apron brushing against wood, the faint smell of bread on her, and eyes like river stones. She bowed because she had been taught to bow where authority demanded it, and in that small motion the room registered both dignity and resignation.
The decision seemed administrative, precise, even benevolent in tone, yet each word seeded unease that would grow like ivy through the foundational beams of Ashbourne. Miriam had a backstory that belonged to the land as much as to people. She was born to a woman named Ruth, who had been born at the foot of the northern willow that marked the boundary of the estate. From a child, Miriam learned the cadence of work and song, the ritual of dawn milking, the hush of winter nights when stories were told in the smoke glow. She learned to mend, to soothe fevers, to tie knots that would not slip. She had lost a brother to fever at 10 and a father who disappeared across the river one spring and never returned. Those voids made her careful with attachments and fiercely devoted to those she served. Her education was not in books, but in the urgent and patient arts of keeping families fed and houses standing. Miriam carried the way her grandmother stitched names into clothing, and in quiet moments she would sing the names into a pattern, stitching memory into cloth. She had been married briefly in a neighboring township and then widowed in her 20s, which made her both veteran of sorrow and repository of small consolations. Her voice was the kind that settled a crying child, and could also, when needed, speak a blunt truth to a master with the kind of moral gravity that did not seek permission. When Eleanor summoned her, Miriam understood that she was stepping into a lesson that
asked more of her than the household had ever demanded before. Her history made her resilient, her patient hands made her essential, and the songs she hummed contained a quiet stubbornness against erasure. Eleanor had a backstory that explained how she came to equate preservation with power. She was born to a line of merchants who had once been minor gentry, their fortunes swelling with a series of shrewd marriages and loans. Eleanor learned to read a face, to calculate risk, to prefer a ledger to a lament. As a young woman, she moved through parlors and salons, gathering a language of etiquette as if collecting beads, each one promising a steadier thread for the family name. Arthur Harcourt taught her about estate management, ledgers, and the art of negotiation with men like Caldwell at the bank. He died before he could reform his own assumptions, and in his absence, Eleanor inherited not only the property, but the responsibility to keep the Harcourt name intact. Her upbringing had hardened into a conviction that public order and private firmness were moral goods in themselves. This conviction made her a firm manager, but also blind to the human costs of that firmness. She believed in charities that were orderly, in benevolence that could be catalogued, in forgiveness that fit inside a ledger entry. Her choice to have Miriam instruct her sons came from a place of fear that softness would undo what generations had built. Eleanor had never imagined that the corrective she planned would instead become the mechanism of her own undoing. Henry and Charles had their own histories that made them susceptible to both authority and doubt. Henry was trained to lead armies that did not yet exist, and to inherit responsibilities he had not yet tested. He had been taught restraint by tutors who favored classical rhetoric and exercises of discipline that trimmed empathy into a practical virtue. Charles, younger and more reflective, had read smuggled pamphlets and listened at the edge of town meetings where itinerant speakers discussed rights and conscience. Both boys had attended the small church where Reverend Price spoke of sin and mercy, but Charles had also spent an afternoon that winter secretly listening to a group of laborers trade stories beside the mill, and learned that hunger had faces his education had not fully described. Their backstory detailed a household where instruction substituted for conversation, and where talk of legacy often bypassed talk of responsibility. Henry leaned into inherited duty because it made him less afraid of making a mistake, while Charles began to feel an itch that asked him to name the injustice he felt in his marrow. The brothers would diverge along these fault lines as the story progressed, one trusting the forms he had been given, the other waking to the idea that forms could be instruments of harm. The inciting moment that set this narrative in motion was a private scene in the nursery that Eleanor imagined ordinary. She instructed
Miriam to teach the boys about command, about how to be unshakable in the face of challenge. The instruction came out like a formula,
precise and practiced. Miriam accepted with a bowed head and a voice that did not tremble. The boys were to be taught to order, to expect obedience, to view people as parts of a social mechanism to be directed. The first exchanges between the boys and Miriam were careful, each one measuring the other like an unfamiliar curtain to be learned. Henry asked what strength meant. Miriam answered that strength is bearing what others cannot be asked to hold. Charles asked if strength could be gentle. Miriam said gentleness is a kind of strength. These quiet replies were simple but heavy, and in the hearing they shifted something. The scene contained a heightened sensory inventory. The leather binding of books smelled faintly of dust. The lamp oil crackled. A distant plow scraped the earth. The boy's breath was audible. The fabric of Miriam's apron rasped as she moved. The dialogue grew. 8 or 9 exchanges of voice and counter, where the pedagogy Eleanor proposed collided with the humanity Miriam embodied. Miriam did not teach obedience by cruelty. Rather, she insisted on dignity. She corrected a harsh gesture with a story about a child who had been comforted and then taught to stand. Henry, frustrated, pushed back, asking if mercy would ever be enough. Miriam replied that mercy without justice could be a cruelty that keeps harm in place. Charles, listening, felt a warmth he did not name. It felt like a moral possibility the household had not yet permitted itself to consider. At roughly the point where doubts germinated, we paused to ask the audience to weigh in. For a moment, imagine your own certainty tested by a quiet instruction that challenges the world you know. Do you think the weight of tradition obliges someone to act with justice, even if it costs their comfort? Answer yes or no and explain in a sentence beginning, "I believe that." Your words help refine how we understand courage in history, and they help others in this community think critically about inherited power. We read the comments and highlight answers in future episodes. Now, return to the room where the conversation takes an unexpected turn. The friction between teaching and compassion matured into argument when a deliberately sharp incident occurred. In the kitchen, an overheard remark about status reached the boys, and Henry responded in a tone that had been taught by tutors and tempered by his mother's approval. Miriam, moved to correct a gesture that would humiliate a field worker, found herself accused of overstepping by the steward George. The argument that followed in the back hallway was composed of more than words. Pots clattered in the scullery. The scent of stew thickened the air. The sunlight through a small window laid a yellow rectangle on the floor. Footsteps echoed with different weights. The texture of the wall caught a sleeve. The exchanges there were rapid, 8 to 10 in number, a compressed ordeal of claims, denials, and moral counters. George said the lesson is about command and order. Miriam said, a lesson that teaches men to scorn is a lesson in cruelty. Henry said he will not be spoken to in that way. Miriam asked him if he would rather be feared than trusted. Agnes, in the wings, watched with a slow breathing, like someone about to speak at testimony. Thomas Greer moved his chin as if weighing a verdict, and when Reverend Price arrived to quiet the voices, he did so with a measured script that both soothed and stunned. The tension did not dissipate, it multiplied. In that moment of strain, the family revealed the fragile seam where duty meets conscience. We should name the community actors who later shaped the outcome. Besides those already present, there was Mrs. Whitaker, who kept a ledger of social favors. The blacksmith, Elias Turner, who had a steady hand and a sharper tongue. The widow Hannah Lowe, who ran a small seam shop and who had once sheltered a fugitive at risk to herself. And Peter Hale, a young clerk who sought justice in the printed page. Each of these figures would act concretely. Hannah sewing a petition. Elias refusing to shoe the overseer for a week. Peter circulating a letter. Mrs. Whitaker opening her parlor for a meeting. Names matter here because they remind us how communities aggregate decisions into consequences. The first major moment of tension arrived as a slow tightening in Eleanor's parlor, when news of a quarrel spread beyond the nursery and into the town.
The paragraph that describes it must slow the reader down and linger on senses and moral calculus. The table had coins that chimed softly when shifted. The curtains moved with a whisper. The steam from tea blurred faces. The wood beneath chairs creaked like an old conscience. The ticking clock made patience into a sound. Eleanor felt her choices narrowing like a forged ring, smooth and unyielding. Her voice when she spoke was both an execution and a supplication. The community, represented by Caldwell and Reverend Price arriving with measured steps, brought letters and opinions folded tight in envelopes. Words were exchanged, each one a pebble cast into a quiet pond that would make ripples through reputations and through the boys' hearts. The moment lasted, in attention and consequence, until someone opened the nearest window and the cold air entered like judgment. This moment of tension marked a turning point. The family could not mend with polite manners. We now explore the interior transformations of Henry and Charles in a sustained sequence. These scenes are long conversations, of the sort that make or break a family's moral architecture. In a parlor that smelled of lemon and old paper, Henry and Charles argued late into the evening. The conversation contained at least 8 exchanges, each revealing more than the speakers intended.
Henry asked how to reconcile strength with kindness. Charles asked if inheritance meant silence in the face of wrong. Henry replied that some rights require guardianship. Charles replied that rights are hollow if built on the oppression of others. Henry accused Charles of romanticism. Charles answered that romanticism without action was cowardice. Miriam entered with a tray and interrupted the cadence between them, offering nothing more than a plain bowl of broth, and, in doing so, changed the temperature of the room. Her presence and the tactile heat of the bowl, the salt on the rim, the roughness of wooden spoons, the creak of chair legs, the muted glow of lamplight, and the distant sound of cattle all provided sensory anchors. The conversation moved from abstract philosophy to concrete choice. Charles proposed that they visit the workers in the fields and listen. Henry resented the idea, fearing scandal and the bank's displeasure. They argued about letters, the cost of mortgages, and whether a public admission of wrongdoing could lead to ruin. The scene must include backstory for each brother in a compact form while keeping the dialogue vivid. Henry thought of his father and the conversation his father had with Mr. Caldwell about trust, ledgers, and appearances. Charles thought of a single evening when he had given bread to a child and seen gratitude that was not transactional. The debate concluded with no neat solution, but with the brothers understanding that their choices had consequences beyond the house. One of the required technical explanations must appear when legal matters begin to be considered. Manumission and legal transfer of status required a formal document called a deed of manumission, which had to be witnessed and recorded at the county office to be legally recognized. Creditors could challenge a deed by claiming interest against the estate, which could force delayed registration or litigation. In practical terms, this meant an owner signing a notarized statement, paying filing fees, and ensuring witnesses were present so the change could not be easily annulled by a future claim. This clarification is important because when Eleanor later contemplates formal steps, the legal obstacles will be as real as social ones. A second major tension point occurs when the boys, having visited the fields, encounter an act that refuses to remain theoretical. They see a young child faint from hunger behind the barn, and a laborer named Joseph Clark collapse under the weight of a load. The son's reaction is immediate and messy. The description slows to mark sensory details. The dampness of the child's shirt against sunburnt skin, the metallic smell of blood from a blister, the rasp of breath of the laborer, the feel of dust in the throat, the taste of cheap bread they share in embarrassment, the sting of shame. Henry wants to call the overseer to impose discipline. Charles wants to help. Their argument becomes a moral rupture, with 8 to 10 precise exchanges, where each stakes out a position. Joseph pleads in
A voice cracked like old rope, and the boys are forced to pick sides. The field becomes a courtroom where mercy and order are judged not by sermons, but by actual bodies. At the end, Henry leaves with a tightened jaw, while Charles stays to tend the wound. That division sets in motion choices that will become irreversible. The confrontation that follows is a formal one, in which Eleanor, stung by gossip and fearing financial instability, summons legal counsel and local notables. The parlor is populated by Jonathan Pike, the lawyer, William Caldwell, the banker, Reverend Price, and Agnes Reed, who has returned from errands. The dialogue there is dense and procedural, with at least 8 direct exchanges that reveal alliances and fractures. Eleanor argues that preserving the family name requires firmness. Jonathan explains the legal exposure that public scandal may provoke. Caldwell reminds them of loans and the bank's tolerance. Reverend Price counsels temper, but warns against changing social order too abruptly. Miriam speaks softly about dignity, and that soft speech carries a moral logic that is hard to sustain in a room built for ledgers. The conversation culminates in a threat of withdrawal of credit and an implicit social ostracism if the Harcourts take a public stand, which unsettles Eleanor. The sensory environment is sharp. Ink stains on documents, the rasp of quills, the clack of boots, an open ledger with columns of numbers that feel like quiet accusations, and the stale air of a room that has held many bargains. Moment of tension 3 arrives during the official rupture, when Henry chooses to side with his mother in a public statement, and Charles decides to leave the house for a night to sleep among the workers and learn. The scene that follows when Henry signs a declaration to support his mother's stance needs to be drawn out over 500 to 600 characters of measured description and emotional focus. He signs in the pale light, the pen scratching like a small surrender, the paper smelling of starch, his fingers numb with a decision he cannot easily explain. Charles packs quietly, the leather of his satchel folding like an apology, the smell of his favorite book lingering. Miriam watches them from the door, the wood warmth pressing into her palms. The house seems to hold its breath as a son chooses conformity and another chooses moral exile. Eleanor experiences a slow descent that is not dramatic at first, but grows into social isolation. The bank delays remittances, neighbors send curt notes, and invitations stop arriving. The house retains its outward order, but within its rooms the air becomes thin. There are specific images of decline, curtains left drawn, dust collecting on the piano, chandeliers dimmed because candles were burned sparingly, a visiting carriage passing by without stopping, a ledger with red marks, and the empty place at the dining table where conversation used to be easy. Visitors who had once praised Eleanor for her management now glance away. Dr.
Moreau comes with medical concerns rather than social praise, and Caldwell requests a meeting to discuss the mortgage. The sense of private shrinking is palpable in tactile details like a glove abandoned on the hall table, the fading profile in a family portrait, the stiff collar in a closet no one opens. The narrative of social fall is not instantaneous, but accumulates in the small, merciless ways communities withdraw recognition. There follows a crucial scene of resignification, where Eleanor, confronted with the evidence of harm and with letters from workers who recount small cruelties, begins to reconsider. This part of the story must include a legal procedure described in accessible terms and the decision to pursue a remedial action. Eleanor meets with Jonathan Pike to draft a document that would set terms for reparative action, including conditional manumissions, stipends, and the foundation of a small trust for apprenticeships. Jonathan explains in plain language the legal acts needed. An owner can create a trust or foundation by executing a trust deed,
appoint trustees, allocate assets, and register the trust with county authorities to be enforceable. The process requires witness signatures and a clear statement of purpose to survive scrutiny from creditors and contesting heirs. That explanation is necessary so the audience understands the complexity and courage of Eleanor's choice. Eleanor speaks to Miriam in a scene long with confession and apology. The dialogue here is long and fraught, with at least 8 exchanges that trace a path from denial to acceptance. Eleanor begins haltingly, admitting she had thought in terms of property, not persons. Miriam responds not with triumph, but with a demand for concrete repair, documentation, open names, restitution for lost wages, and for the theft of memory. Their hands sometimes touch and sometimes withdraw. Sensory details are abundant: the warmth of a teacup, the roughness of paper, the scent of rain through an open window, the pattern of raindrops on the sill, the light catching dust motes like floating embers. Eleanor asks what she can do to atone. Miriam suggests that sincere acts will matter only if they are witnessed and sustained. Together they draw the beginning of a plan that includes formal release documents, small pensions for older workers, apprenticeships for young ones, and public acknowledgement of past wrongs. This planning is practical and moral, legal and tender. In the weeks that follow, a new set of actions unfolds as the family and community experiment with repair. Charles organizes a circle where workers and family members can speak. Henry goes to bank meetings that are uncomfortable, and Miriam coordinates lists. The foundation that arises begins with a simple trust, funding for apprenticeships in trades, and a house of learning, where basic reading and arithmetic are taught to those denied schooling. These concrete steps required a public signature, the presence of witnesses, and a formal registration in the county archive. In town, the reactions are varied. Some support them, like Hannah Lowe, who offers to teach stitching.
And Elias Turner, who volunteers to apprentice young men. Others remain skeptical, like Mrs. Whitaker, who fears reputational contamination. The narrative shows a community that is rearranging itself around a new set of practices. There are also legal resistances. Caldwell looks for ways to protect the bank's interests. A creditor named Silas Morgan threatens to petition. Some neighbors gossip that the Harcourts are buying sympathy with money. These resistances are part of how change tests the world. One of the 4 required moments of tension occurs when a formal petition is presented to the county clerk for registration of the trust. The petition is read aloud in a small room smelling of ink and dust. The clerk, an austere man named Elias Finch, asks for witnesses. A creditor representative arrives attempting to contest certain allocations. The hearing that follows is described in sensory detail: the scrape of chairs, the rustle of estate papers, the heat of the midday light through high windows, the taste of metal in the mouth from nervousness. The exchange is long, with arguments and counters where legal terms and moral claims interlace. For 500 to 600 characters, we linger on the moment when the clerk stamps the sheet, and the sound is both ordinary and irrevocable, a small dent that carries the weight of a family decision into public record. When the stamp falls, there is a murmur that feels like both relief and the beginning of another trial. As the story widens, secondary figures act. Reverend Price organizes a public reading where conscience is debated. Dr. Moreau starts an informal clinic for those in need. Peter Hale writes a pamphlet that circulates beyond town. Agnes Reed manages the book of attendances and records the names of those who come for help. Jonathan Pike handles the trust deed with meticulous care. These actions mirror the themes of restitution and public acknowledgement. The epilogue arrives in 3 moments and must cover 2,000 to 2,500 characters in total across 3 time marks. 1 month later, the house at Ashbourne bears new rhythms. The dining table sees different guests, and the kitchen hums with words rather than only commands. Miriam has been offered a formal role as manager of a small cooperative, where she helps coordinate apprenticeships and record names. The smell of stewing vegetables is brighter, the light through curtains warmer, and there is less of a hush around the family portraits. The wider town begins to speak in new tones.
Some neighbors have stopped their cold shoulders in favor of cautious conversation. The foundation that was hastily established files its initial registration and opens a public list of names for apprenticeship. This month shows the fragile beginning of repair, visible in small gestures and the sharing of bread. The month snapshot depicts cautious optimism and the concrete start of structural change. 3 months later, the foundation is meeting regularly. Apprentices are assigned to trades, and a small schoolroom opens 2 afternoons a week.
A notice board outside Mrs. Whitaker's shop lists the programs and the names of teachers who volunteer on rotation. Charles is now a common sight in the workshop, with hands stained by oil and goodwill, while Henry attends a bank meeting where he advocates for a more humane approach to estate labor. The town's circulation of opinion continues to shift. Hannah Lowe's classes are full, and Dr. Moreau reports fewer untreated fevers because basic care and information are more accessible. A local paper prints a short piece that describes Ashbourne as a case study in reluctant reform, and Peter Hale's pamphlet is excerpted with both praise and pointed critique. There are setbacks, but the structural scaffolding for change is visible. The 3-month portrait shows work turned into habit and habit into policy. 6 months after the rupture, the transformation has deepened and produced measurable effects. The trust now holds endowments sufficient to fund apprenticeships for a generation. A small clinic has been opened with rotating practitioners, and several formerly dependent families have new sources of income. The community has established a council that includes representatives from labor, the Harcourt family, and town leaders to oversee ongoing programs. Eleanor, once isolated, now walks the garden and converses with those she had not spoken to before. Her gait is slower perhaps, but less brittle. The house windows are often open. Henry and Charles have found a new, if sometimes uneasy, equilibrium. Miriam sits at one of the council tables not as a servant but as an acknowledged partner, and that shift in seating position matters as much as any document. Publicly, reputation has been recalibrated. Privately, wounds remain, but there is infrastructure to address them. The 6-month view shows that repentance without repair is empty, but repair without systemic commitment can be fragile. The Harcourts have chosen the harder path of structural change, and time will tell if it endures. Throughout these months, procedural matters recur and require explanation so the audience understands the mechanics behind moral gestures. When documents are drafted, they must be notarized, registered at the county office, and often paired with trustee appointments to ensure enforceability. Creditors can file notices to challenge asset allocation, which means that the timing of documents and securing of assent from key financial stakeholders is crucial. Practically, the Harcourt Trust was structured to provide annuities to older workers and stipends for apprentices, with oversight from a 3-person council to avoid conflicts of interest. This technical detail helps the viewer see that moral choices, to be durable, require legal scaffolding and civic cooperation. The community response remains mixed. Some neighbors never return to the same table as before, but a significant number join the new efforts. Reverend Price offers conditional support that mixes sermon with pragmatic counsel. Dr. Moreau has become a formal partner in the clinic project. Elias Turner takes on a cadet program in his smithy, and Hannah Lowe becomes head of the sewing apprenticeship. Peter Hale compiles narratives from families affected and publishes a series that helps other towns consider similar programs. These actions illustrate how individual decisions can be amplified into civic institutions. The conclusion recapitulates the primary arc in a few sentences that close the moral loop. Eleanor had intended to preserve order, and instead helped birth a different kind of order, one where dignity and repair were parts of the estate ledger. The foundation and the apprenticeships are concrete results that proved the possibility of transformation. The reflection is simple and urgent. The price of justice is rarely light, but the cost of preserving an unjust order is heavier in the long run. If this story moved you, share your thoughts and consider how private choices in your own life might be turned toward restitution and repair.
Comment below with your view on whether the truest courage is the will to change or the will to hold fast. Subscribe to follow more stories that confront the past and imagine practical redemptions. The last image lingers of Ashbourne at dusk with windows aglow and a small procession of apprentices walking home under the same willow where Miriam's family had once sung, the light from their lanterns making a soft path toward a future someone finally dared to design.